The last day of school is supposed to be filled with laughter, goodbyes, and the promise of summer freedom. But what if I told you, for some students, it became the most terrifying day of their lives? Tonight, you'll hear 3 true stories of last day of school horror. Stories of empty hallways that whisper, classrooms that hide secrets, and goodbyes that turned into nightmares. These are not legends, these are real. The last day of school had finally arrived, and the building buzzed with the electric energy of freedom that was just a few hours away. Students rushed through the hallways carrying yearbooks, shouting to their friends, and scribbling signatures across pages that would soon be tucked away as memories of their school years. Teachers stood by their doors, some smiling with relief that another year was over, while others wore the bittersweet expression of knowing they might never see some of these students again. It should have been a day of nothing but joy, but beneath the surface, there was something unsettling about the air inside the school that morning, something most people were too distracted to notice. The sun shone brightly through the windows, yet shadows seemed to stretch further than they should, crawling across the lockers as if alive. A group of students, waiting for the final bell, whispered among themselves about the stories that circulated every year. The last day was said to be cursed. Some spoke of a janitor who had disappeared decades ago, never to be seen again, right after summer began. Others mentioned the old wing of the school, closed off for years, where strange noises echoed when the halls were empty. Most brushed it off as nothing more than rumors told to scare freshmen, but for a few students the fear clung tightly, refusing to let go. Sarah, a junior with a love for horror novels, felt goosebumps rising on her arms even as her friends laughed and signed yearbooks. She could not shake the feeling that someone was watching them, not in a casual way, but with an intensity that made her stomach twist. Every time she looked behind her, the hallway was full of students, yet none of them seemed to notice the heavy atmosphere pressing down on the place. The chatter felt louder than usual, but also strangely distant, as though muffled by something unseen. As the hours dragged by, anticipation grew. Students counted down the final classes, glancing at the clock over and over. Sarah sat in her history classroom, staring at the second hand as it ticked closer to freedom. The teacher barely bothered to lecture, letting students talk quietly and sign papers. Yet Sarah couldn't focus on anything but the strange flickering of the lights above her. They buzzed faintly, blinking every few minutes, and each time they went out, even for a split second, she swore she could see someone standing at the back of the classroom, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. During lunch, the cafeteria erupted in celebration, food trays clattering and students shouting across the tables. A group of seniors started chanting, banging their fists in rhythm, ready to throw their papers in the air the moment the last bell rang. But Sarah's eyes were fixed on the windows lining the cafeteria walls. Outside, the bright summer day seemed normal. Yet every time she glanced out, she saw fleeting movements in the reflection, shapes darting behind her. Even though when she turned, no one was there. She rubbed her eyes, telling herself it was just nerves, just her imagination getting the best of her. The anticipation was unbearable by the time afternoon arrived. Students began gathering their things, some already leaving early. The building grew quieter in pockets. Hallways that had once been full now stretched long and empty. Sarah's locker was in one of those deserted corridors, and when she went to collect the last of her belongings, the silence swallowed her whole. The sound of her locker door creaking echoed too loudly, bouncing off the walls. She quickly shoved her books into her backpack, eager to get back to the noise of her friends. But before she could close the locker, she heard it a whisper. It was so faint that she almost dismissed it, but the sound was clear, someone saying her name. She froze, her heart thundering in her chest. Slowly, she turned to look down the hallway. Nothing. Every locker was shut, every classroom dark, not a soul in sight. She swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she slammed her locker shut and bolted toward the main hall, telling herself she must be tired, that she was letting the old rumors get into her head. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to her like a heavy coat. When the final bell finally rang, the halls erupted in celebration, a roar of voices filling the air as students ran for the exits. Papers fluttered through the air like confetti, laughter echoed from every corner, and the long-awaited freedom had arrived. Yet through all the noise, Sarah couldn't forget what she had heard in that empty hallway, the whisper that carried her name, and the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too far as she left the building that day. As the echoes of laughter and celebration died down, the school began to empty. Most students had rushed out the doors, eager to meet friends, start summer jobs, or simply feel the warmth of the afternoon sun on their skin. The once bustling building was falling silent, the noise replaced by the creak of lockers being shut one last time and the faint squeak of shoes against the polished floor. In that silence, the school felt different. Without the chaos of students filling every corner, the long corridors became intimidating, every sound magnified and every shadow stretching out like it had a life of its own. Sarah lingered behind with two of her friends, Emma and Jason. They had planned to meet in the library before heading home, partly to sign each other's yearbooks and partly to avoid the chaos of everyone shoving through the main doors. When they walked through the halls, their voices carried unnaturally far, bouncing off the lockers as though the building itself was listening. Emma joked that it felt like they were trespassing in their own school, as if the moment the final bell rang, the building belonged to something else. Her words were meant to be funny, but none of them laughed. The three entered the library, a massive room that always felt a little too quiet, even on regular days. The rows of tall bookshelves loomed like walls, and the smell of old paper hung thick in the air. They sat down at one of the long wooden tables, spreading out their belongings. For a few minutes, things felt normal. Jason cracked jokes, Emma doodled in the margins of her yearbook, and Sarah forced herself to smile, though her mind kept wandering back to the whisper she had heard earlier. She couldn't shake it. She hadn't told her friends about it yet, afraid they would laugh or dismiss it, but it gnawed at her with every passing second. As they were signing yearbooks, a faint noise drifted through the library. It sounded like footsteps. At first, Sarah thought it must be the librarian, though she was sure the staff had already left. The steps were slow, deliberate, and they echoed unevenly against the tiled floor, as if whoever was walking had no intention of hiding but also no reason to be there. Jason noticed it too, his smile fading as he glanced around the empty aisles of shelves. Emma brushed it off, insisting it was just the building settling, or maybe another student grabbing a book, before leaving for the summer. But the sound didn't fade, it grew louder, moving closer, circling through the rows as if pacing. They waited in silence, straining to hear more clearly. Then it stopped. The stillness that followed was heavier than anything before, pressing down on them, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Sarah's palms grew sweaty as she whispered, asking if anyone else felt like they weren't alone. Jason nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the shadowed end of the room. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a book fell from one of the shelves. The sound was so sudden and sharp it made all three of them jump. The book landed flat on the floor, pages splayed open, though none of them had seen anyone near the shelf. Jason, trying to sound brave, got up to check. He walked cautiously toward the sound, but the rows seemed endless, the shadows swallowing him as he moved further away from the table. He picked up the book, but when he did, he noticed that the surrounding shelves seemed disturbed, as if several other books had been shifted or tugged. He put the book back quickly and returned, his face pale but his voice calm as he muttered that they should probably leave. Emma tried to laugh it off again, but even she couldn't hide the tremor in her voice. They packed their things in silence, the weight of the atmosphere making them move faster than they meant to. But as they walked toward the exit of the library, the sound of footsteps started again. This time, it was directly behind them. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she turned her head, just enough to glance back, but there was no one there. The aisles stood empty, the shelves looming, the fallen book now perfectly back in place, as if it had never moved at all. The three broke into a hurried walk, not daring to look back again, their own footsteps blending with the ones that seemed to follow. Every time they slowed, the sound slowed too. Every time they quickened, it matched their pace. When they finally pushed open the library doors and stepped into the hallway, the sound stopped completely, leaving only the echo of the door swinging shut behind them. They didn't say a word as they walked down the hall, each of them aware that something in that library had been moving around them, unseen but very much present. The hallway outside the library was quiet, and the stillness felt heavier than before. The sunlight that had once streamed through the windows seemed dimmer now, as though the day itself was fading faster than it should. Sarah clutched her backpack tightly, her fingers digging into the straps as she tried to shake off the unease. Jason walked a step ahead, glancing back every few seconds as if making sure nothing was following them. Emma stayed close to Sarah, her earlier attempts at joking completely gone, her face pale as she whispered that maybe they should just leave their stuff and get out of the school altogether. But before they could reach the main doors, Sarah stopped suddenly. Her eyes were fixed on a row of lockers near the end of the hallway. One locker stood slightly ajar, its metal door hanging open just enough to catch the light. At first, it seemed ordinary, maybe left unlocked by a careless student rushing out for summer break. But as they drew closer, an odd smell filled the air. It was faint but sharp, something like rust, mixed with dampness. The kind of smell that didn't belong in a school hallway. Jason frowned and muttered that it was probably just garbage left behind, but Sarah felt compelled to look. She hesitated only for a moment before stepping toward the locker, her sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. The door creaked louder when she touched it, as though resisting being opened. With a slow push, she pulled it wide enough to see inside, and her breath caught in her throat. Inside there were no books, no forgotten jackets, no signs of a normal student's belongings. Instead, there was a stack of old papers, yellowed and brittle, piled at the bottom. On top of them lay a single photograph curled at the edges, showing a classroom filled with students from years ago. Their faces were smiling, frozen in time, but Sarah noticed something strange. One of the students in the picture had no face. Where their features should have been was nothing but a blank, smudged void, as if the photo had been tampered with or aged unnaturally in that one spot. She showed the picture to Emma and Jason, who both stared in stunned silence. Jason laughed nervously, saying it was probably a prank, maybe some senior's idea of leaving behind a creepy joke. But Emma shook her head, pointing out that the uniforms in the photo were different, older, from a time before any of them were even in school. Sarah flipped through the papers, but most were faded beyond recognition, with only fragments of words visible. Phrases like missing, incident, and not found. Her chest tightened as she realized these weren't just forgotten papers, they were records, pieces of something that had been deliberately hidden away. Suddenly, the locker door slammed shut on its own with a deafening clang. Sarah stumbled back, nearly dropping the photograph, and Jason cursed under his breath as they all jumped. The sound echoed down the empty hall, rattling in their ears long after the door had shut. Emma whispered that they needed to get rid of the photo, that they shouldn't be carrying something like that with them. But Sarah felt an odd pull to keep it, as though throwing it away would be a mistake. Against her better judgment, she slipped the photograph into her bag, telling herself it was just paper, nothing more. They walked quickly now, trying to shake off the unease. But the moment they passed another row of lockers, a new sound filled the air. A faint tapping, rhythmic and steady, coming from inside one of the locked doors. They stopped in their tracks, their eyes darting toward the noise. The tapping grew louder, like fingernails scratching against metal, faster and more desperate with every second. None of them dared open the locker this time. Instead, they hurried down the hall, their footsteps echoing unnaturally loud against the floor. As they turned the corner, Sarah felt her backpack grow heavier, as if the simple photograph she had taken was dragging her down. She didn't dare open her bag to check, but the thought gnawed at her. It felt less like she was carrying the photo, and more like the photo was carrying her, pulling her deeper into whatever secret the school was hiding. Emma kept glancing behind them, her face tight with fear, while Jason tried to reassure them, though his voice shook each time he spoke. When they finally reached the stairwell that led to the exit, the sound of lockers rattling echoed behind them, one after another, slamming in rapid succession, as though something unseen was chasing them through the hall. The building that had been filled with laughter and celebration just hours earlier now felt alive in the worst possible way, and each slam of metal reminded them that leaving might not be as simple as just walking out the door. The stairwell was colder than the rest of the school, a chill rising from the concrete steps, as though the air itself had been trapped there for years. The walls were lined with faded paint, peeling in some places, and the light bulbs flickered dimly, casting shadows that stretched long and narrow along the walls. Sarah, Jason, and Emma moved quickly, their footsteps echoing down the stairwell, but no matter how fast they went, the sound of another set of steps trailed behind them, always just a few paces back. Jason tried to convince himself it was the old building settling, but each time they paused, the footsteps paused too, perfectly in sync, waiting, listening. They reached the second landing and slowed down, breaths coming in uneven gasps. Sarah glanced at Emma, who was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she gripped the railing. Jason attempted a smile, trying to appear strong, but his pale face betrayed him. The silence pressed down again, heavier than ever, until a voice cut through it. It was faint, like a whisper carried from the other side of the stairwell, but clear enough to make them freeze. It was an older man's voice, rough and deliberate, saying the words, "You shouldn't be here." Emma gasped and grabbed Sarah's arm, her nails digging into her sleeve. Jason shouted back nervously, demanding to know who was there, but the stairwell answered with only silence. No movement, no figure, nothing but the fading echo of the warning. They stood there for a long moment, afraid to move, until Sarah finally urged them forward, her gut telling her that standing still was worse than continuing down. They hurried the rest of the way, reaching the bottom of the stairwell, but when they pushed open the heavy metal door, it didn't lead outside as it should have. Instead, they found themselves in a narrow corridor they had never seen before. The walls were older, marked with water stains, and the floor was littered with dust and debris. The faint buzz of a failing light came from above, and at the far end of the corridor stood a classroom door. It was strange, out of place, as if they had stumbled into a part of the school that hadn't been touched for decades. Jason muttered that it must connect to the old wing, the part of the school that had been shut down years ago. He remembered the stories, the ones about a teacher who had died mysteriously during detention, and the rumor that no one ever entered that room after dark. Sarah felt her stomach twist as she realized the photograph she had taken from the locker might be connected to this place. The missing face in the picture, the records that spoke of people not found. Still, curiosity drove them forward. They approached the door cautiously, the number plate above it rusted and unreadable. The window in the door was clouded with grime, but faintly, they could make out rows of desks and chairs still inside, as though the room had been frozen in time. Jason pushed the door, and to their surprise, it opened with a long creak. The smell that poured out was suffocating, dust, mold, and something metallic that reminded them all too much of blood. Inside, the desks were arranged neatly, but every single chair was turned backward, facing the wrong way, as if the students who once sat there had been forced to look away from the front of the room. On the teacher's desk, a stack of yearbooks was piled high, though they were far older than any of theirs. Sarah picked one up carefully, wiping away the thick layer of dust, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with faces, but many of them had been scratched out with deep, angry marks, leaving behind gouges in the paper where eyes or smiles once were. In the back, the "in memory off" section listed names she didn't recognize, students and teachers whose photos were all missing or defaced. Emma whispered that they needed to leave immediately, her voice shaking. But before Sarah could close the book, the pages flipped on their own, stopping at a blank photograph frame. Her stomach dropped as she realized the caption beneath it bore her name. She slammed the book shut in panic, her hands trembling as she tried to convince herself she had misread it. Jason grabbed the book, but when he opened it again, the blank spot was gone, replaced by another student's picture. He tried to laugh it off, claiming Sarah's mind was playing tricks, but his voice cracked as he spoke. The air grew heavier, colder as the lights flickered overhead. Then came the sound, scraping like chairs dragging across the floor, though none of them had moved. One by one, the backward-facing chairs began to shift, turning slowly toward the front of the classroom, their legs screeching against the tiles. The three of them backed away, pressing against the wall, their hearts racing. At the front of the room, the chalkboard began to write on its own, chalk moving as though guided by an invisible hand. 3 words appeared slowly, each one deliberate, each letter jagged and uneven: YOU and XT. Emma screamed, and Jason grabbed her hand, pulling both her and Sarah toward the door. But when they reached it, the heavy wooden frame slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. The yearbook fell from Sarah's hands, landing open on the floor, its pages fluttering wildly as though caught in a wind that didn't exist. The sound of footsteps filled the room again, this time louder, closer, circling the desks as though someone unseen was moving among them. The 3 of them clung to each other, eyes wide, realizing the substitute's warning from earlier in the day wasn't a joke at all. It had been a warning no one was meant to ignore. The door rattled violently as Jason pulled on the handle, but it refused to budge. Each attempt made the hinges groan, as though the room itself was determined to keep them trapped. Sarah pressed her back against the wall, her breathing shallow, watching the chalkboard. The words, YUR and XT, began to smear, the letters stretching downward like they were melting, dripping into a black stain that spread across the board until it looked like tar seeping through the cracks. Emma clutched her arm tightly, her nails biting into her skin, whispering frantically that they had to get out before something worse happened. The desks began to move, scraping across the floor in unison, shifting into new positions. They weren't random movements but deliberate, forming a half circle around the three of them, as though closing them in. Each screech of wood against tile made Sarah's chest tighten more. Jason kicked one of the desks aside, but as soon as it hit the wall, another slid back into its place, blocking their way. The sound of chairs scraping followed, filling the room with an unbearable screeching chorus. From the far corner, a faint tapping started, steady and rhythmic, like chalk against the board but sharper, almost like bone against wood. It grew louder faster, until it turned into pounding. Sarah turned toward the sound and saw a locker, sized cabinet near the teacher's desk. The door shook violently, as though something inside was trying to break free. Her body froze, torn between running to the locked classroom door and staring at the cabinet as the pounding grew unbearable. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went silent. The desk stopped moving, the pounding ceased, and the air became so still that even their panicked breaths seemed out of place. Emma whispered that she couldn't take it anymore and bolted for the classroom door, pounding on it with her fists. Jason ran to help her, throwing his shoulder against the wood, but the door didn't move an inch. Sarah forced herself to inch closer to the cabinet, though her heart screamed at her to stop. The silence was worse than the noise, and she needed to know what had been trying to escape. She reached out a trembling hand and touched the cabinet door. The surface was ice cold, so cold it burned her fingertips. She pulled back with a hiss, but in that instant, the door burst open. A gust of freezing air rushed out, carrying with it a suffocating smell of decay. Sarah stumbled backward as a stack of notebooks and papers tumbled onto the floor. They weren't normal school supplies. The pages were yellowed, brittle, some of them stained dark with what looked like dried blood. Emma screamed when she saw that several of the notebooks had names written on the covers, names that matched the in memory off list Sarah had seen in the yearbook. Jason knelt and picked one up, his hands shaking. The first page had a photograph glued to it, a faded image of a smiling student, but the eyes had been carved out, leaving only two jagged holes in the paper. Beneath the photo was a list of dates, starting with birthdays and ending abruptly with a final date labeled simply as last seen. Jason dropped the book as if it had burned him, his voice breaking as he muttered that they weren't supposed to see this. Before anyone could react, the chalk on the board began to move again. This time it didn't write words but drew a crude outline of a figure with no face. Its limbs were jagged, uneven, stretching across the board in impossible angles. The outline pulsed faintly as though alive, and then the sound of footsteps returned, heavy, deliberate, circling closer. The desks rattled again, pushing in tighter around them, the circle closing. Emma cried out, begging for it to stop, while Jason grabbed one of the chairs and smashed it against the classroom door. The wood cracked but didn't break, the door resisting every blow. Sarah's eyes darted back to the yearbook she had dropped earlier. The pages still fluttered wildly, but when she crouched down to look, she froze. A new photograph had appeared on one of the pages. It wasn't faded or old like the others. It was fresh, showing the three of them standing in that very classroom, wide-eyed and terrified. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as she realized the photo was of this exact moment, their fear immortalized before anything had even happened. Emma and Jason crowded around to look, their faces draining of color when they saw it too. The sound of breathing filled the room, deep and guttural, coming from all directions at once. It was louder than their own, a sound that vibrated through the floor and into their bones. Sarah clutched the book to her chest, her body trembling, but the moment she did, the lights flickered violently, plunging them into near darkness. In the dim glow, the faceless outline on the board seemed to step forward, its chalk body stretching out of the surface as though peeling away from the wall. The room shook as the desks slammed closer, leaving the three of them trapped in the smallest possible circle. Jason raised the broken chair like a weapon. Emma sobbed uncontrollably, and Sarah gripped the cursed yearbook tightly, feeling its weight pulse in her hands as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The faceless figure loomed closer, its chalk, white body shimmering faintly in the flickering light, until it towered over them. Its blank face bending low as though studying its next victims, the lights blinked out completely, plunging the room into suffocating blackness. Sarah could hear Emma's ragged sobs, Jason's sharp breathing, and the low rumble of that other presence moving closer. The air was icy, pressing against their skin like frost, each breath leaving a faint mist in the darkness. The desks that had boxed them in rattled again, shifting even closer, until the three of them were huddled shoulder to shoulder with no space left to move. Sarah held the yearbook tightly to her chest, her knuckles white, her heart pounding so violently it felt as if it might break free. Then a light flared suddenly, dim and sickly yellow, illuminating the chalkboard. But it wasn't chalk on the surface anymore. Instead, the blackboard had turned into something wet, glistening, like tar or thick ink spreading across it. Shapes began to form within the dark substance, distorted faces pressing out as if trapped behind glass, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. Emma's cries grew louder as she pointed at one face that seemed horribly familiar, the same faceless void she had seen earlier in the old photograph. But now it twisted and turned as though alive. Jason tried again to smash the door, but his blows had grown weaker, more desperate. Each time he struck, the sound that came back wasn't wood, but something deeper, almost like hitting flesh. Sarah's stomach lurched with terror, realizing the door itself was no longer what it seemed. They were sealed in a room that wasn't part of the school anymore, but something else entirely. The yearbook in Sarah's hands began to heat up, the cover growing unbearably warm until she could barely hold it. She dropped it onto the floor, and the pages flew open on their own, landing on a spread that showed rows of photographs. At first, they were ordinary faces, students and teachers long forgotten, but then one by one, the images started to vanish. The faces blurred and faded, leaving behind blank spaces. Sarah watched in horror as three of the frames began to shift, filling slowly with her own face, then Emma's, then Jason's, captured in perfect detail. The images solidified, sealing them into the curse book as though it were documenting their fates in real time. Emma backed away, shaking her head violently, begging for it to stop. She stumbled into one of the desks, and it didn't just jolt, it grabbed her. The wooden frame seemed to stretch unnaturally, long splinters twisting like fingers around her arm. She screamed, thrashing wildly as the desk pulled her in closer. Jason leapt forward, smashing the chair he still held against it, splintering the desk into pieces, but not before Emma's skin had been torn where the wood had gripped her. Thin red lines bled across her arm, but she was free, trembling and sobbing into Jason's chest. The blackboard pulsed again, and one of the shadowed faces inside pushed further outward, its features distorting until its mouth split unnaturally wide. A sound burst from it, not quite a scream, but a low droning wail that rattled their teeth and made their bones vibrate. Sarah pressed her hands against her ears, but the sound wasn't only outside. It was inside her head too, echoing and growing until she thought her skull might crack. In a sudden burst of clarity, Sarah snatched up the yearbook again, holding it above her head. The droning stopped instantly, as though whatever controlled the room was focused solely on her now. The book's weight seemed impossible, heavier than stone, but she forced herself to flip through its pages. On each one, the photographs writhed, the faces shifting as if begging to be freed. Her shaking fingers found the page with their images again. Without thinking, she tore at the paper, ripping it down the center. The room screamed. It wasn't Emma, it wasn't Jason. It was the building itself. The walls shook violently, dust raining from the ceiling as the chalkboard cracked straight down the middle. The black, tar-like substance splattered onto the floor, sizzling as though it burned. The desks skittered backward, releasing their hold, crashing into one another with a metallic clatter. Jason seized the chance, throwing his weight into the door one last time. This time it gave way, swinging open so hard it splintered against the wall beyond. The three of them bolted out, stumbling into another hallway. But it wasn't the hallway they remembered. The lockers were rusted, their doors hanging crookedly. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, as though decades had passed since anyone had walked there. Faded posters clung to the walls, warning of events long forgotten. The fluorescent lights above buzzed weakly, flickering as though struggling to hold on to life. It was the school, but not as it should have been. Emma clutched her injured arm, her face streaked with tears, while Jason tried to steady his breathing, his eyes darting up and down the unfamiliar hall. Sarah still clutched the torn yearbook, its pages fluttering in a wind that didn't exist, the photographs inside still twisting, still alive. None of them spoke, but all of them knew they had stepped deeper into the nightmare, pulled into a part of the school that should never have existed, and there was no telling if there was a way back. The hallway stretched on endlessly, dim and distorted, as if the building had shifted into some other reality. Sarah felt the weight of the torn yearbook in her arms, its pages fluttering though the air was still. Emma leaned heavily against Jason, her injured arm trembling from pain, her face pale in the weak light. Every locker they passed seemed wrong, their surfaces warped, their handles bent as if something had clawed at them. Some of them rattled faintly, though no one touched them, as though things hidden inside were restless and waiting. Their footsteps echoed strangely, the sound not matching their movements, as if there were more people walking with them than just the three. Jason urged them forward, whispering that they had to find a way out, but his voice carried too far, bouncing back from the walls in distorted tones that didn't sound like him anymore. Sarah bit her lip to keep from answering the echoes, afraid of what might respond. They reached a corner, and at the end of it was a door unlike the others. The frame was heavier, lined with rust, and a faded placard above it read, "Classroom 13. Emma's breath hitched, and she shook her head furiously, whispering that they shouldn't go in, that the number alone felt wrong. But the hallway behind them groaned like something alive, the lockers rattling in a rising crescendo, forcing them to move. Jason put his hand on the door, and though Sarah tried to stop him, it swung open before he even pushed. The classroom beyond looked preserved in time, but not like the others. The air was thick with dust, yet the desks were perfectly arranged, all facing the chalkboard where faint words were scrawled. Sarah squinted at them and felt her stomach drop. The board read, "Detention. Present Sarah. Jason, Emma." Her name at the top, written in harsh strokes of white chalk. Emma broke down, muttering that they weren't supposed to be here, that they had done nothing wrong, but the board had already claimed them as though their punishment was preordained. The door slammed shut behind them, and the sound reverberated like a final lock ceiling. Jason rushed to it, pulling desperately, but it didn't move an inch. Sarah's gaze was drawn to the teacher's desk at the front, where another yearbook sat open, its pages waiting like a mouth ready to swallow. She wanted to look away, but her body moved closer as though pulled by invisible strings. Each step made her chest heavier, her breath shorter. Emma clung to Jason, begging him to make it stop, but the lights above them flickered violently, then steadied. The room felt occupied, filled with a presence they could not see. Sarah reached the desk and peered down at the yearbook. Her heart skipped as she realized the pages were blank, but as she leaned closer, words began to appear. They weren't typed or printed, but handwritten, names scratched into the paper with a frantic hand. She flipped through quickly, her hands trembling, until she saw her own name etched on the very last page. The ink was fresh, the lines still wet. The sound of a chair scraping across the floor made her jump. She turned and saw one of the desks pulling itself out from the row, stopping neatly in front of the chalkboard. A chair slid behind it, and though no one sat, the wood creaked under invisible weight. Another desk moved, and another, until rows began filling as if unseen students were taking their places, their shapes hinted at in the shifting dust, and the unnatural dents pressing into the wooden seats. Emma buried her face against Jason's chest, refusing to look, while Jason muttered curses under his breath, his bravado crumbling as the room filled with phantom classmates. The chalk lifted itself from the tray and began to write again, scraping loudly as it etched a message across the board. "Detention is forever." The words sent chills through Sarah's spine, and in that instant, the invisible students turned their faceless heads toward her. The air grew heavier, pressing down as though the room itself wanted to suffocate them. Sarah stumbled back, nearly knocking over the cursed yearbook, but the pages flipped again, revealing a sketch of Classroom 13 drawn in perfect detail, with 3 small figures at the center of it. The phantom students began to hum, a low droning sound that vibrated through the desks. It wasn't a song, but something hollow and oppressive, building louder with each second. Jason grabbed Emma's hand and pulled her towards Sarah, their backs now pressed against the teacher's desk. The sound grew unbearable, the lights flickered, and Sarah realized the walls were closing in. Not physically, but visually, as though the shadows were devouring the room piece by piece, leaving nothing but darkness. She forced herself to open the yearbook again, praying for an answer. Her eyes fell on a new page, and her heart froze. It was a photograph of the 3 of them in that very classroom, surrounded by faceless students, their heads bowed as if resigned to stay forever. The yearbook was no longer documenting their story. It was writing their future. She slammed it shut, but the humming stopped abruptly, leaving behind a silence that was worse than the sound. The faceless students turned back toward the board, their heads twitching in unnatural movements, as if awaiting instruction. The chalk moved again, slower this time, dragging out every letter with deliberate cruelty. 3 words appeared across the board, sharp and final: "See us SBGNEG." The silence that followed was unbearable, so thick it pressed into their ears until even the sound of their own breathing felt muted. Sarah gripped the yearbook so tightly her knuckles burned, afraid that if she loosened her hold even a little, the phantom students would notice and turn on them again. Emma clung to Jason, her face streaked with tears, whispering over and over that they couldn't stay, that they had to get out before class began. But there was nowhere to run. The door was locked, the windows covered in grime so thick no light seeped through, and the only way forward seemed to be deeper into whatever trap the school had become. The chalk twitched against the board, the message, CLAS SBG and NNG, smearing until it stretched downward like dripping paint. Beneath it, new words formed, each letter sharp and deliberate, A T to C wheel B to Kian. Jason cursed under his breath and tugged Emma toward the door again, trying to force it open, but the knob spun uselessly in his grip. Sarah's eyes darted to the phantom students, their faceless heads still bowed, their bodies sitting unnaturally still in the desks. Yet she could feel them waiting, listening, as if eager to see what came next. The temperature plummeted. Sarah's breath came out in a white puff, and the metal edge of the teacher's desk frosted over beneath her touch. The sound of heavy footsteps filled the hallway outside the door. Slow, steady, deliberate. Whoever or whatever it was dragged something across the floor as it moved, the scrape echoing through the walls like nails against stone. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door, and the classroom fell into such silence that even Emma's sobs faded. Then the door creaked open, not slammed like before, but carefully, slowly, as though the one entering wanted them to feel every moment of dread. No one stepped inside at first. Instead, the smell arrived, thick, sour, metallic like rust and rot mixed together. Then a shadow filled the doorway, stretching impossibly tall against the wall before the figure stepped into view. It wasn't a teacher, not anymore. The thing that entered wore the tatters of an old suit, the kind a teacher might have worn decades ago, but its face was wrong, blurred and shifting like smoke that never settled. Where its eyes should have been were only deep hollows, and its mouth hung open as though in a silent lecture. It carried a long piece of chalk in its skeletal hand, the bone fingers gripping it tightly enough to grind it down to dust as it moved. Emma whimpered and buried her face against Jason's chest. Jason held her tight, his eyes wide but defiant, though his body trembled. Sarah felt her own legs weaken, but she couldn't look away from the figure. It walked slowly to the front of the room, each step echoing too loudly, the floor groaning under its weight. It turned toward the chalkboard, raised its hand, and began writing names. Each letter screeched as the chalk scraped across the surface. The first name was Sarah, then Jason, then Emma. The phantom students straightened in their seats all at once, the sound of wood creaking in unison filling the air. Their heads turned toward the three, faceless yet somehow watching. Sarah clutched the yearbook tighter, desperate for something to change, but when she opened it again, she found the same names written in its pages in the same jag script as on the board. Beneath the names were blank spaces, waiting for photographs. She felt the weight of inevitability pressing on her, as though no matter what she did, the book had already claimed them. Jason snapped. He rushed forward, grabbing a desk and hurling it at the chalkboard with a roar. The desk shattered, pieces of wood scattering across the floor, but the chalkboard remained untouched, the names shining brighter than before. The figure turned then, slowly, its faceless head tilting toward Jason. The chalk in its hand dropped to the ground, and its mouth stretched open unnaturally wide. A sound poured out, not a voice but a droning hum that shook the walls, the same noise the phantom students had made before. The desks rattled violently, the lights above flickered and burst, plunging the room into a half, light filled with sparks. Emma screamed, clutching her ears, blood trickling from where the sound pierced too deep. Jason staggered back, his defiance crumbling as the droning grew louder. Sarah fought to keep her focus, flipping through the yearbook, hoping for anything, some clue, some weapon hidden in the cursed pages. She stopped on one section that hadn't been there before, a list of rules written in blocky letters. Rule 1, attendance is mandatory. Rule 2, no one leaves early. Rule 3, the lesson never ends. Beneath the rules, a note scrawled in smaller handwriting read, "Tear your page or be erased." Her eyes widened. She flipped to the section where their names were written, staring at the blank photo slots beneath them. The implication was clear, but the thought of ripping her own name from the book filled her with a dread deeper than anything else. Would it free her, or erase her completely? The humming grew unbearable, vibrating the bones in her skull. The phantom students began to rise from their seats, their faceless heads tilting as they shuffled forward, the classroom filling with the sound of dragging feet and scraping wood. Sarah's hand shook violently as she tore at the page. The paper resisted, tougher than it should have been, almost alive. Jason saw what she was doing and rushed to help, yanking at his own name with desperate strength. The moment the first tear split the page, the droning faltered, just for a second, the figure at the chalkboard twitching as though struck. Emma, terrified, grabbed for her own name, ripping at the page even as blood from her injured arm smeared the paper. The sound of tearing filled the room. Louder than the hum, louder than the footsteps, until the classroom itself shuddered, the phantom students jerking violently as if their strings had been cut. The figure at the front of the room shrieked without sound, its faceless head splitting apart like broken glass, its form collapsing inward. The chalkboard cracked down the middle, the words and names splintering as the room convulsed. The floor gave way beneath them, dropping into darkness as the last fragments of desks and books vanished into the void, dragging Sarah, Jason, and Emma into the unknown below. The fall seemed endless, as though they had been dropped into a void with no bottom. Sarah clutched the torn yearbook against her chest as the air rushed past her ears, her screams swallowed by the abyss. Jason and Emma tumbled beside her, their arms flailing helplessly as shadows clawed at their ankles, pulling and dragging, trying to slow their descent. Just when Sarah thought she would fall forever, the darkness thickened beneath her, and she hit the ground hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She gasped. Rolling onto her side, the yearbook still clutched tightly as though her life depended on it. The place they had landed wasn't like any part of the school they remembered. It was a basement, but not the kind that belonged to reality. The walls were formed of rotting bricks, slick with mold, and water dripped steadily from the ceiling into shallow puddles on the cracked floor. The air smelled of mildew and rust, thick and suffocating, and the flicker of dim light bulbs swaying overhead barely pushed back the gloom. Jason staggered to his feet first, his face pale but determined, while Emma groaned, holding her injured arm close, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah pushed herself upright, her legs trembling, and scanned the room. Rows of broken desks were stacked in corners like discarded bones, some overturned, others shattered beyond recognition. On the far wall, graffiti covered the bricks, written in chalk and ink, and even what looked like dried blood. Words repeated themselves again and again, Les Dawai, Atida NC, and Inavar Lev. Some phrases were crossed out violently, while others were underlined as though someone had been desperate to emphasize them. Sarah's gaze caught on a single sentence scrawled larger than the rest, Tch les ditech. Her stomach lurched and she quickly looked away. A sound echoed from deeper in the basement, the dragging shuffle of footsteps. Emma whimpered, pressing closer to Jason, and Jason tightened his arm around her shoulder, his eyes fixed on the shadows beyond. Sarah wanted to suggest they stay quiet, but it was too late. The footsteps grew louder, closer, accompanied by the squeak of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Then a figure emerged from the darkness, its body tall and hunched, wearing the same shredded suit as the faceless teacher they had seen before. Only this one carried a long metal pointer, its tip scraping sparks from the floor as it dragged. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and though it had no eyes, Sarah felt its gaze lock onto her. The figure stopped in the center of the basement, raising its pointer high before slamming it against the ground. The sound reverberated like thunder, and all around them the broken desks began to stir. One by one, the fragments pulled themselves together, rebuilding into full desks, their legs screeching against the floor as they formed rows once again. Invisible students filled them, their faceless heads twitching, their bodies jerking like puppets on tangled strings. Within seconds, the basement had transformed into a grotesque version of a classroom, with Sarah, Jason, and Emma standing at the front like trapped performers. The figure began to move its hand, as though writing on a board that wasn't there. Words appeared in the air, glowing faintly, Female EXAM. Sarah's chest tightened, her breath shallow and uneven. The yearbook vibrated in her hands, its pages fluttering as though aware of what was about to happen. She opened it and nearly dropped it when she saw the new pages, questions written in the same frantic script. But they weren't normal questions. The first read, WHO wheel suar vivi. The second D, hate bolo yo you sacref vi. The last was blank, waiting for an answer that hadn't yet been written. Jason read over her shoulder, his face pale. It wants us to choose, he muttered, his voice trembling. Emma shook her head furiously, backing away, saying she wouldn't play whatever twisted game this was. But the figure raised its pointer again, and the faceless students slammed their hands on the desks in unison, a deafening sound like thunderclaps. The ground shook, the lights flickered, and Sarah realized that refusal wasn't an option. Her eyes darted between Jason and Emma, panic surging through her veins. She couldn't answer those questions, couldn't decide between her friends, but the yearbook's pages pulsed like a living thing, demanding a response. The second question burned into her mind. Uj willow wayu sakrafi. She felt her throat tighten, tears prickling her eyes as she whispered that maybe the book wasn't asking for them to sacrifice each other but something else. Jason grabbed her arm, urging her not to listen, but Emma's gaze was fixed on the figure, her lips trembling as she whispered that the book wanted one of them. The faceless students pounded again, their heads jerking violently, their bodies leaning forward as though eager for an answer. The figure raised its pointer, and the air itself seemed to close in around them, suffocating, demanding. Sarah's hands shook as she clutched the yearbook tighter, her thoughts racing in chaos. If she refused to choose, the book would choose for them. If she chose wrong, they might all be erased. She looked at Jason, then at Emma, then down at her own reflection in the glossy page. The empty question at the bottom stared back at her, waiting to be filled. The figure's pointer slammed into the floor again, and the entire basement groaned like a living beast, cracks forming in the bricks above. Water poured down in rivulets, flooding the floor as the faceless students rose from their desks. Sarah's voice caught in her throat as she realized the exam had already begun, and the price of failure was more than any of them were ready to pay. The basement shook with violent tremors, the water climbing rapidly around their ankles as the faceless students lurched forward, their movements stiff yet relentless. The figure at the center of the room raised its metal pointer and scraped it against the floor, the sound shrieking through the air like a scream. Sarah clutched the yearbook tighter, her hands raw from holding it, her heart pounding as the questions burned across the pages again. WHO while Sarvavi and Wu. 8 Wailu Sacrifici. Jason tried to steady Emma, who was pale and trembling, blood dripping down her arm from where the wood had torn her earlier. He looked at Sarah, his jaw set, and shouted over the roar of cracking walls that they couldn't play the thing's game, that they had to fight it. But Sarah knew in her heart that the book wasn't asking. It was demanding. The faceless students pounded their desks again, though the water had risen high enough to soak their wooden frames. Their heads tilted back in unison, mouths forming empty black voids, a terrible chorus of silence filling the room. Sarah flipped frantically through the yearbook, its pages shifting on their own, forcing her to stop at one final entry. The page showed a blank photograph space with the words, "The last Almi," written above it. She felt her blood run cold. The book wasn't asking for just a choice. It was asking for someone to be erased completely, as if they had never existed. Emma screamed when she realized what Sarah was staring at. She begged not to be chosen, her voice broken, her sobs echoing against the basement walls. Jason clenched his fists, furious, shouting that they wouldn't give the thing what it wanted, that they would all make it out together. But Sarah could see the truth burning in the glowing questions on the page. The lesson would not end until the sacrifice was made. The figure raised its pointer again, aiming it toward Emma, as if already deciding for them. Without thinking, Jason shoved Emma behind him, spreading his arms wide. He looked at Sarah, and for a brief moment his defiance turned into something softer. His lips trembled as he whispered that maybe there was only one way. Before Sarah could stop him, he grabbed the yearbook from her trembling hands and slammed it shut around his name. The paper screamed as it burned beneath his touch, his photograph melting away as if erased by unseen hands. Sarah shrieked and tried to pull it back, but Jason shoved her away, his face resolute even as his body began to blur at the edges. The faceless students froze, their pounding hands falling silent. The figure tilted its head, lowering the pointer slowly. Jason's voice broke through the chaos one last time, calling Sarah's name, telling her to run, telling her to live, and then he was gone. Erased. Not a body, not even a shadow left behind. Only the water rippling where he had stood, and his voice echoing faintly before dissolving into silence. The yearbook's pages went blank, one after another, until it snapped shut in Sarah's hands. The water stopped rising. The faceless students slumped back into their seats, their forms collapsing like broken mannequins. The figure at the front of the room lowered its head, the blur of its face folding inward until it collapsed into nothingness. The basement crumbled around them, the bricks cracking wide to reveal light beyond the darkness. Sarah pulled Emma close, clutching her tightly as the world shattered into blinding white. When Sarah opened her eyes, she was lying on the school's front steps in the bright light of morning. The building loomed behind her, silent and still, looking just as it always had, with no sign of the horrors inside. Emma was beside her, breathing shakily, alive but scarred, clutching her injured arm. But Jason was gone. Not just from the school. Gone entirely. His name wasn't in their memories except in Sarah's heart. Emma's face was blank when Sarah whispered his name, like she couldn't even recall who he was. The yearbook in Sarah's lap had turned to ash, scattering into the wind, leaving her with nothing but the weight of loss. The bell rang faintly inside the empty school, a sound that should have been ordinary, but it carried with it a hollow echo. Sarah stood slowly, helping Emma to her feet, both of them staring at the building one last time. The last day of school was supposed to be a celebration, but for them, it had become a nightmare etched into their souls. Though Emma would never remember Jason, Sarah would carry his sacrifice forever, knowing he had given himself to break the curse. And so, the school stood silent, its doors closing on another year, its secrets buried again, waiting for the next last day, when the lesson would begin once more. Thank you so much for joining me on this terrifying journey. I truly appreciate your time, support, and courage to explore these chilling stories with me. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember, sometimes the scariest things hide in the places we think we know best. Until next time, thank you for being here.